Hello again! If you're new here, my name is Marcello. I talk about books, including a lot of mystery and thriller novels, and a few months ago I posted a video entitled The Best Mystery Novels Ever Written. This title was intentionally hyperbolic, as the title of this very video is, because the algorithm rewards hyperbole. In any case, many of you soon started informing me via often thoughtful, occasionally angry comments that the list that I had produced was not a good representation of the genre as a whole. And if you are one of those commenters, you are right. I am woefully underread. I was then and I am now, although I am slightly better read now. There's just so much out there, and mysteries aren't the only books that I like to read. So in hindsight, there are a ton of books that are probably measurably better in multiple ways than many of the entries on my list. Specifically, I appear to have a big old blind spot when it comes to the Golden Age authors, but there were some contemporary names that were frequently mentioned as well. So I've spent the last couple of months between making holiday-themed and Animorphs videos and being sick and taking care of my sick family, reading through some of the most common suggestions, and in this video, I am going to give my impressions of those books. I am not going to assign them a rating or anything like that. I'm just going to describe the premise and give my overall impression in as much detail as I see fit. This is only part one of me going through all of your recommendations. There are going to be 5 books in this video. I have got the next 3 or 4 videos lined up in terms of what authors I'm going to be covering. I know that I'm missing a lot. Thank you so much for taking the time to recommend these books. So without any further delay, here you go. The best mystery novels of all time, according to my comments section. You fine people. Alright, so easily the most heat that I got was due to my never having completed a Sherlock Holmes book. Well, you will be happy to hear that I have fixed this greatest of my shortcomings by reading A Study in Scarlet. I actually listened to the audiobook, as some of you suggested. I've had the Stephen Fry collection in my Audible library for like a decade, so I just downloaded the app again, and I focused, and I listened to it, and for the most part, I enjoyed it quite a bit. So here's what I thought. And if you love Doyle and Holmes, please understand that I'm sharing my personal opinion here. I'm just a YouTuber. I don't think I'm a better writer than Arthur Conan Doyle or anything. I'm just talking about the book. So the book was pretty good. I appreciate Holmes for how human he is and how visibly he grapples with his demons. It's a little different from some of the other older fictional detectives who are often as stalwart as they are shrewd. Holmes is more prone to bouts of egotism, and not in the sort of self-celebratory way that Poirot is, but in a more defensive sort of chip on his shoulder type of way. It's not a bad thing, and the character of Holmes was easily a highlight of the book for me. His detection methods, however, do seem to necessitate about as much encyclopedic knowledge of esoterica as they do sound reasoning skills. I'm also certain that in a mystery book that I read recently, a fictional detective says something to the effect of, "Do not expect me to walk in and look at the cigar ash on the carpet and tell you who did the murder," and now I know that this was an allusion to this book. I don't remember what book that was. If you know, you can let me know, please. So the plot of the book is very straightforward. The first portion of the book is our introduction to Holmes, him proving the legitimacy of his methods to Watson, and then Holmes and Watson moving in together. This was my favorite part of the book. Subsequently, there is a murder, which Holmes is called on to consult. The murdered man was found in a locked room with the word Rasha written on the wall in blood. Now, a simple mystery is not necessarily a bad mystery, and I enjoyed reading this investigation, but I feel like I should probably read another Holmes book after this, because the entire experience for me was kind of tainted by the fact that about halfway through the book, right as the action is really picking up, everything stops dead in its tracks, and we are suddenly brought to Utah to hear about some random, or as it turns out, not random, guy and his daughter, and how they survive starvation in the wilderness by converting to Mormonism, and we basically get like the whole life story of this guy and his daughter, and it winds up being relevant to the plot because it reveals the motives for the murder, but it is about the slowest way that I've ever had to experience exposition of this type, and it does kind of stop the momentum of the book quite a bit. You've got to read through like pages of Utah before you even realize that you are reading the backstory of one of the characters central to the mystery. And honestly, I think I have a little bit of an issue with having the motive be that hidden for that much of the plot. We don't get any of the information needed to discern the true motive of the killer throughout the narrative until the killer is caught, and then the narrative stops in its tracks to give us the story of the last 40 years of his life. I feel like if the motive is that important, then it should take up a more substantial part of the actual story, and not just be a non sequitur injected into the narrative right at the peak of the action. Anyway, presuming this is not something that Doyle does in every book, I'm going to read another Holmes book without this narrative structure, because everything else about this book was very enjoyable, and I want to read more of Holmes as a character. So maybe in the next video of this series I will read Hound of the Baskervilles, and we'll see how that goes. Alright, so next I read Still Life by Louise Penny. She was one of the most frequently mentioned authors in the comments section, and definitely the most frequently mentioned modern author, so I felt like I had to include her in this first wave of recommendation reading. Still Life is the first book in the Armand Gamache series. Gamache is the chief inspector for the Provincial Police Force of Quebec, and I believe this whole series of books takes place in Three Pines, a small town outside of Quebec. The mystery at the heart of this novel involves a woman who is an amateur painter who recently had a piece of hers accepted to a showcase of local artists. This woman was subsequently found dead in the woods, shot with an arrow. The book is told from multiple perspectives, including that of Detective Gamache, and the reader gets an intimate view of all of the different characters, relationships, and aspects of life in Three Pines. This is all exceedingly enjoyable, and it's executed very well by Louise Penny. Something I also appreciated about this book was how deeply it delved into the emotional fallout that a murder can have on a small town and its residents. It's easy to lose sight of the gravity of a murder, especially when you spend so much time reading about fictional murders, but this book sort of makes you pause and think about the real human toll of something so cataclysmic. Hearing myself describe this right now, this book doesn't sound like something I would typically be into, but I think the quality of Penny's writing is just very high, and again, she executes this really well. I won't detail the plot too much here. Gamache investigates the murder, he questions everyone in town, various secrets are unearthed, red herrings are chased down and discarded. It's pretty standard genre fare, but Louise Penny has created something here that is definitely greater than the sum of its parts. I will be reading more of this series. I also see that Alfred Molina plays Gamache in the TV adaptation, so now I have to read more books so that I can watch the show. One more thing about Still Life, I've seen people complain that this series is too psychological and that they aren't really mysteries that you could solve with the clues on hand. This is just stuff that I read in Goodread reviews, but I totally disagree, at least with this specific book. Believe it or not, I was able to guess the killer on this one. I didn't get it perfectly well, but I did guess who did the murder, and loosely why, using clues that were in the book. This didn't detract from my enjoyment of the book at all. I really loved this, and I look forward to reading more of her work. Next, I read P.D. James' A Mind to Murder, and this one was so good. It's the second in her Adam Dalgliesh detective series. I couldn't procure a copy of the first one via my usual means, Libby, but I didn't feel like I was missing any critical information going into the second. I do plan to read the first. So Dalgliesh is an investigator for the New Scotland Yard, but he's also a successfully published poet, a fun and unique twist that I did not see coming. He is thoughtful and stoic and much closer to human in his deductive techniques than the more superhero-esque fictional detectives like Poirot and Holmes with his crazy knowledge of all of the, cigar ash. The plot of this book involves an administrator for some sort of cutting-edge mental hospital who is found dead in a locked room in the basement, surrounded by a mess of patient records. This was a very straightforward murder mystery, but I enjoyed it immensely for that. There's a lot of value in executing a simple concept well, and James is clearly able to do this. The characters were each unique, they were easy to discern from one another, the mystery was as well plotted as any given Christie novel, and the prose wasn't just tolerable, it was honestly kind of beautifully written at times. Anyway, the bulk of this book is just Dalgliesh questioning various hospital staff, but this one is told in the third person, and it does switch perspectives throughout, including brief windows into the minds of multiple smaller characters. This keeps the investigation interesting, and it also allows for a really fun action sequence towards the climax of the book, where we get a window into the perspective of the criminal as they try to make their final escape. As I mentioned, the book was written in the 60s, and the window that it provides into what mental health care looked like at that time, as well as the subtext of the author's commentary, added an element that made this book all the more interesting. I honestly feel like I am not doing it justice here. I would like to read more P.D. James books just so that I can more confidently and informedly speak on the quality of her writing, but I will end on this note. When people ask for murder mystery recommendations, if they're relatively new to the genre, I'll usually recommend Christie just so they can learn the ropes and the tropes. But now I'm going to recommend Christie and P.D. James, so thank you to everyone who recommended her. I'm going to be making my way through her entire catalog. I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this one. Next, I read The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie, and I was going to say that this was my favorite of the modern recommendations as I read, but the only modern books I read were this and Still Life, and honestly it is a pretty close call which one I enjoyed more. So I'll just say that I consider myself very fortunate to have been recommended these two excellent modern mysteries. This one was an absolute delight, and I read it in about a day and a half, switching between the audiobook and print. The audiobook narrator was really good and added a lot of character, I thought. The book is about protagonist Flavia, the youngest of three girls who lives with her single father in a country manor in England. The family is not as well off as their residents would suggest, and I only mention this because it is an important piece of background information. Anyway, Flavia is super precocious and very skilled at chemistry in spite of only being 11 years old. Her vocabulary is also a joy to read, and the book is told in first person, allowing us to really get to know the character through her unique narrative voice. Speaking of that voice, I could see how Flavia's linguistic style might be annoying to some, but Personally, I loved it, and I found the book to be very funny. Anyway, the crux of the mystery is that one morning, a dead bird is found on Flavia's doorstep with a postage stamp in its beak. Hours later, she encounters a stranger in the cucumber patch outside her house and witnesses his dying breath. Flavia is, of course, delighted that something so interesting has happened and immediately sets to solving the mystery. The rest of the book features Flavia riding her bicycle around the English countryside, questioning people, sneaking into places, and eavesdropping on conversations, ultimately unraveling a mystery that goes back decades. This was an enjoyable read from beginning to end. The characters were an obvious strong point, especially the protagonist, as I've mentioned, who was exceedingly charming. The setting is also very cozy and well written, and the mystery itself was solid. The actual methodology and underlying puzzle behind the mystery is maybe a little less rewarding in this than, say, a Christie or P.D. James book, but the storytelling is just so good and so engaging that this matters a lot less to me. This book was about as heartwarming and charming for me as The Maid was, and I think the quality of writing was honestly a little bit better, so I'm going to be reading the rest of these series for sure at some point. I do have so many books to read. All right, the last recommendation that I read was Dorothy Sayers' Whose Body? This is a Lord Peter Wimsey mystery and the first in the series. Sayers is a contemporary of Agatha Christie, and honestly, Peter Wimsey reminded me a lot of Poirot. They obviously have their differences, but they are both very funny, kind of acerbic, sartorial, extremely smart, and seemingly one step ahead of everybody all the time. Whose Body was a fun read, and the mystery at the core of this book was an engaging puzzle that I was not able to figure out at all, but which was definitely fair play, which I love. The language took some time for me to adjust to, but I switched back and forth from print to audiobook, and the audiobook reader had a hilariously dramatic British accent that I enjoyed quite a bit, and which made the prose a fun feature. I will say that this book seemed to focus much more heavily on the puzzle aspect of the mystery and plotting that mystery than it did on the characters, as all of the characters were a little bit two-dimensional, save for Lord Wimsey, of course. Understandably, this is the first book in the series, so I'm going to have to read some later installments as well to see if this remains the case. I also know that this is a feature of the time, but I can't help but compare it to Murder on the Links, which came out the same year, and while that one also suffers from characters that lean towards two-dimensionality, I found them to be just a little more fleshed out than what I read here. In any case, this was a lot of fun to read, and I'm better for having done so. I'll be reading a few more of these books at some point, but probably after... the list. The list is so long. You guys should see it. It's like 150 books long. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much for leaving these recommendations. I am much more well-read now than I was before I started on this journey, and I really hope to continue it. This is the first installment in reading your recommendations. I've got enough for like 30 videos, but don't let that stop you from leaving a comment and recommending new videos. Any book that gets enough mentions or that just seems intriguing to me, I will 100% be reading for this series. I will beat this horse until it is dead, like a true YouTuber. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you like. If you don't want to, that is perfectly fine with me. Thank you.